Hi, welcome to the Tarotology Podcast. My name is Erin and I am your host and resident tarologer or tarologist. And this episode, we are going to be looking at using tarot in accordance with the phases of the moon. And we're also going to be exploring the forecast for October of 2020 and maybe just a sneak preview of what to expect for the rest of the year and the energy to come. So I am very excited to talk about this particular subject because I love looking at the phases of the moon and aligning my energy and my intentions with what is going on in the cosmos, and particularly with the moon as it affects our emotions and our feelings and our spirituality and our energy for those of us who are really attuned to its cycles. So let's take a deep dive into how to use the moon in your readings. So first of all, when you're doing a tarot reading, especially tarot readings for yourself, you want to set your intentions and you want to be very, very specific when you go in about how you're going to be asking your questions and what you're looking for. And that's really big part of it that trips up a lot of novice tarot readers is how do I phrase my question so that I get the best answer and so that I get what I'm really looking for? Because if you're not very clear when you go in, it makes it a lot harder to figure out what you're trying to get. And the cards often reflect that. And sometimes you get mixed messages or you get something and you're like, well, this doesn't really apply. So part of that has to do with being very thoughtful on the front end and figuring out how you're going to word your question or phrase the question that you want to ask the cards. And so how does that align with the phases of the moon? You may be wondering. Well, great question. So if we look at the phases of the moon and the cycles of the moon, there are clearly two main phases. I mean, there really are multiple phases, but there are two big ones that we want to first start with when exploring where we are in the lunar cycle. And those are the waxing phase and the waning phase. And so you may be familiar with these, but let's just go over them just to set a foundation. So in the waxing phase, the moon is growing. It's getting larger. Every day we're getting more and more light. There's more visibility. And during this phase, you want your questions to reflect that, right? So you want to think about what can you grow? What can you expand? Look for words like gain, add, increase, call to, or just bring to you or bring to your life. On the opposite side of that, we have the waning phase. And during the waning phase, it's when the moon diminishes in size. There's less and less light. We're going from the growing phase starts with the new moon. Once we get to the full moon, we switch gears and we're now waxing until we get back to the new moon and then start a new phase. So during this waning period, we want to focus on the opposite. We want to focus on what can we decrease? What can we remove, let go of, rid, shed, send away? And one that you hear a lot, what can you release? What no longer serves you? Okay, so now that we sort of understand the difference between the waxing, growing phase and what can we bring, what can we add, how can we enrich? We understand the waning phase. What can we get rid of? What can we remove? What can we purge? De-stress, detox, delete. Let's look at a quick example. How about we look at one of the things people tend to focus on is money. How can I acquire more wealth? That would be in the waxing phase, right? How can I bring it to me? I want to generate money. But we're being intentional, right? And we notice, oh, we're in the third quarter phase of the moon. Well, maybe we don't want to look so much at how can I bring money. Maybe we want to be very intentional and say, well, what can I get rid of? So in that case, how can I rid myself of debts? How can I get rid of what I owe people? How can I get rid of the debt? Which one would assume would then free you up for accumulating wealth, right? So being very intentional and specific with your questions and aligning it with the phases of the moon, I feel like it adds a level of just connection with the energies in play already in the universe. And so whenever you can align yourself and work with the energy that's there rather than against the energy, you're going to usually see a better result. Let's take it a step further. how can you harness some of the peak energies of the moon cycle, which there are many different phases of the moon. And I go into great detail with them in some of my classes. And we talk about how that relates to personalities, people born with certain moon phases in their natal charts. And we look at the 8 key phases, but we're going to focus on the 2 biggies today. And that is the new moon and the full moon. So what is the new moon? Well, new moon occurs when the moon is in close proximity to the sun. And because of that, we don't really see the moon in the night sky. It's sort of hidden from our view. And so the new moon, because it is close, astrologically, it's close to the sun, we want to think about how do we use the energy of the sun in that way? How do we, when it's in sort of the shadow of the sun or in the umbrella of the sun, how do we take advantage of that energy? And so that is a good time to look at those projects or things in your life that you want to initiate. Again, because we're harnessing the power of both luminaries in conjunction to one another, in close proximity to one another. It tends to be pretty swift and severe in terms of its consequences. So you want to be careful about what you start in the new moon, because you may get it quicker than you thought. When we are looking astrologically at where the sun and moon are in terms of the zodiac, this is when the moon is in the same sign as the sun. So for instance, right now we are in Libra in terms of the sun sign, the Libra period. So the new moon would be in Libra. And on the opposite side of things, we are looking at the full moon. So when the full moon is in the night sky, everything is bright, everything is lit up, everything is full. And during the full moon phase, the reason why the full moon is visible in the sky is because the moon is in opposition, so opposite the sun in the night sky. And that means it's able to fully reflect the sun's light and shine it back down upon us in all its glory. And so when that happens, we know that the moon is in the opposite zodiac sign of the sun. So for instance, in this particular month, when we have the sun in Libra, then we're going to have a full moon that is in, well, depends a little bit, but earlier this month, let's say, we have the full moon in Aries, which is the opposite zodiac sign from Libra. Okay. So during the full moon phase, we want to focus on things we want to cultivate, things we want to manifest or fulfill in the fullness of time. So unlike the new moon phase where it's kind of sudden, this gives us a chance to really fully realize what we want. So this might be a better time for trying to figure out how to manifest things than the new moon if you are wanting things to come about in a more natural way, in a more seamless way, as opposed to the new moon where it's going to happen, but it may be just really quick. And there, you have to deal with that consequence a little bit. There's this great meme, and it's at a restaurant. It's like a menu, and it says, "We serve 3 things: cheap, fast, and good. You can have 2." So that's kind of the idea of the new moon. It's like, well, you're gonna have to give up on one of those things. It's gonna be fast, but is it gonna be good, or is it gonna be cheap, right? So, if you're worried about that a little bit, about potential consequences of getting something done expeditiously, then perhaps the full moon is the better phase for you to focus on. But there are definitely situations where you need something to change. Something has to give. In that case, the new moon is perfect for you. And before I dive deeper into looking at the full forecast for October, which granted, we're already about a third of the way through the month. So it's going to be a little bit of a retrospective for the first full moon that we had on October 1st. But before I dive into that, I wanted to just give a quick shout out to a friend of mine, the Dawdling Writer. She is a fantastic author tuber out there, and she recently took one of my timing classes and applied the concepts just beautifully to a writing project that she is working on through the month of October. So if you want to check her out, she has the October Moon Phases Writing Challenge. You can find her on YouTube. Just look up Dawdling Writer and you will find her. So giving a quick little shout out. Okay, so looking at October. So on October 1st, and I love this about October, is that it It just works out so perfectly with the moon phases this month. We begin and end on a full moon, which I think is beautiful and glorious for this month that is going to be somewhat challenging in a very challenging year as it is. So let's explore a little bit about how we can use this to our advantage when we're doing our tarot readings for ourselves or for our family, friends, for others. How do we use this energy that's going on to get to the heart of matters, or to better phrase our questions, or focus on what maybe we should be looking at and reflecting upon during these times based on what's going on in the cosmos and in the universe? So on October 1st, we had the full moon in Aries, and that occurred about 5:05 p.m. Eastern time. You can do the math and figure out what that was in your time zone if you're not Eastern time. And in that particular cycle, we had, again, full moon in Aries, sun was in Libra. So the Libra Aries axis is an interesting one between balance and harmony, and also energy and potentially conflict. And how do we manage that fun little axis dynamic? So usually it's a great time for using that Aryan energy. And how can you apply that to your creativity? You can apply that to your life. Very dynamic energy, very bold energy. It's when we're feeling a little more bold. The problem with this particular alignment, well, not really the challenge with this particular alignment, is that it occurred when Mars is retrograde in Aries. So the moon was, kind of conjunct a retrograde Mars, which means we're dealing with a lot of Aryan energy. And also Mars is moving backwards. It's spending so much time in Aries this year, 6 months in Aries this year. And it's usually a pretty quick moving planet. It only spends like maybe 4 or 6 weeks in a sign. So it's in its home sign, which is good, but it's going backwards in its home sign. And it's just stuck in all this pent up Aryan energy and Mars energy. And so there's a little bit of tension there, potentially some tempers flaring and conflict. And so because of its proximity with the emotional moon, the moon is our emotions and our spirituality. And so again, that temper thing is what we need to watch during that time, or needed to watch during that time. So if you are looking at the tarot and trying to figure out how to phrase questions, or what you could be looking at during this time, some examples of questions might be, how can you release that energy during that waning period that follows the full moon? How can you release that energy into a more creative outlet so that it doesn't stay pent up and come out in some other less constructive manner? Moving on, and now looking a little bit ahead, we are looking at a new moon in Libra this coming week on October 16th, and that'll occur around 3:31-ish p.m. Eastern time. I love the new moon in Libra energy because it is usually very balanced and harmonious. We have both the sun and the moon in Libra, which is a very let's all get along, kumbaya energy. But again, 2020 isn't an easy one, right? It has to give us a few curveballs. It will be forming a T-square. So there will be a square happening with Capricorn and the heavy planets that are in there, which is Pluto and Saturn and Jupiter. So all those power struggles and dynamics. Along with the fact that it will also be in opposition to that Mars that I just talked about, that is retrograde still in Aries. And so again, we're looking at a very tense formation here that potentially it could be a good thing that we're bringing that balance into the equation. But because we're also dealing with so many of these planets that it will be forming a T-square with, there's potential for it to be less peaceful than normal. And hopefully, again, it brings some diplomacy or tact to the table. But that's something we do need to be mindful of. How do we be diplomatic? How do we be tactful during this time? So some example questions, maybe, how can you bring balance or harmony to the areas of conflict or instability in your life? So really focusing on, how do I bring the balance? How do I harness all of the good energy, the good things to do with the moon in Libra? And how can I use that to my benefit during this period? And then the last moon phase we're going to be looking at in October happens on October 31st at 9:49 a.m. Eastern Time, which is Samhain or Halloween. It's exciting. We have a full moon on such a important holiday in terms of if you are someone who celebrates Halloween and Samhain and the idea of it's the time the veil between the worlds is the thinnest. We have so many cultures where we celebrate our ancestors during this time. We have All Souls Day, we have Dia de los Muertos, we have just this connection with those who have gone before, this connection with who we are and where we come from. And it's just so exciting to have a full moon as well to end this month. And not only that, but it's going to be a full moon in Taurus. And Taurus is the most stable placement for the moon. Taurus energy is very stable. It's very, low key and very grounded energy. That's a good word for it. Very grounded energy. It is an earth sign, so that makes sense. But it is definitely one of the better placements to have the moon in a natal chart because it brings this level-headedness to your emotions, which sometimes, we can let our emotions run wild a little bit, or we can get them out of check and let some other impulses take over. But this is a very grounded, stabling energy for the moon. And so we have the full moon that's happening. And the good news is it is going to be trining Capricorn. So they're both earth signs. So it's going to be forming a trine with Capricorn and all of those planets that are in Capricorn right now. It's not going to be an exact trine. It's a trine by sign on the 31st. And so usually trines are much easier aspects. They tend to lend a bit of ease and compatibility because they're in the same element. And so that's really good news for us as we get towards the end of this October period and as we start looking ahead to where we're going in the coming months. It will be, however, coming close to and about to enter the orb of being conjunct Uranus in retrograde, which is currently hanging out in Taurus as well. Once it does start getting into that orb of influence and getting closer to being conjunct, you may look for little surprises to pop up. Uranus brings innovation and brings sudden occurrences and unexpected things to the table. So there may be a little bit of, emotional surprise of sorts coming. But I think we can look to this full moon on October 31st and say, okay, and focus our questions and focus on how can I bring stability to a certain area of my life? We've all been in flux for a long time. So, okay, this is a moment I can take a step back and I can try and figure out how to get grounded, how to get centered. How can I bring a little bit of stability to an area of my life that needs it right now? And that brings us to looking ahead to the rest of 2020 and what that has in store for us. And I won't do a deep dive right now, but just want to give a quick couple of dates to keep in mind in case you want to start looking ahead and planning. So we will have a new moon November 15th, and then the full moon on November 30th is actually going to kick off the eclipse season for December of 2020. And what is eclipse season for those who are not as well versed? Well, that is about a 35-day period in which at least 2 and possibly 3 eclipses can occur. And so it has been for the past 18 months or so occurring across the Cancer Capricorn axis, which again, we've had so much going on in Capricorn that it'll be nice to get out of that cardinal Cancer Capricorn opposition and move into some new energy. And it's going to, during this particular one, we're going to start the eclipse season with a penumbral lunar eclipse in Gemini. So we're moving to the Gemini Sag axis, and that's going to be for the next 18 months. And so something to look at there is that's going to be moving from an earth water axis to air fire axis. And why does that matter? Well, if you've been listening to some of my previous podcasts or reading some of my blog entries, you'll know that we are headed into the age of air as we get some of those heavy planets out of Capricorn and into Aquarius. And I don't really want to call it the age of Aquarius. Some people call it the Aquarian age or age of Aquarius. It's not quite the same. We're getting there, but let's just talk about it as the age of air, or the air era, as it were. So we're starting to see that happen right there, right? We're getting our first little taste of it with this first eclipse that's going to be starting off our eclipse season with the full moon in Gemini. And then our next key phase is going to be that new moon on December 14th, which that one is going to be our total solar eclipse. And that's going to be in Sagittarius. So that will be really fun to have this total solar eclipse that's going to start all of these major transitions that we're going to be seeing that week, really, in December, as we get a lot of these planets out of Capricorn finally and into Aquarius. And we enter the air age, and we finally get a bit of fresh air and can breathe a bit easier after all of that Capricorn heavy energy. And I need to be cautious and not overpromise that things are going to be easy. We are still going to be dealing with a lot of the after effects of this year, and all of these heavy conjunctions that were taking place. That's not going to suddenly vanish in the middle of December, and it's not going to go away. We're still going to be dealing with it, and we're still going to be dealing with a lot of the uncertainty. Air is a very unstable sign. It is movement. It is flow, free flowing. It is communication. It is technology. And so it's all of these things we've had a little precursor to, with having to adapt, having to change, having to get used to using different modes of communication, different technologies to connect with people. So I'm not trying to promise everything's going to be rainbows and cupcakes come end of December and beginning of 2021. But I think we're going to find ourselves shifting and adapting. That's what air is. It's very adaptable. And we're going to suddenly realize that we can work with these changes rather than try and stand firm against them. We can flow with them. And it's going to make life a little bit easier for us to learn how to be flexible and how to go with that flow and how to go with that change rather than stand resolute and try and confront it and try and resist it. We can learn to sort of embrace it. And I think that's going to help us in the long run to get to a much more positive dynamic in our lives. And so then we're going to end the month with a full moon on December 29th. And that's going to sort of bring us to the end of the last quarter of 2020 and the beginning of 2021. So that's kind of what we have to look forward to. And hopefully in future episodes, I may do a bit more of a deep dive and do some more regular forecasts for people if this is something that seems to be of interest. But you can definitely find more information on my blog at learntarology.com. I encourage you to check that out. I also do some readings and classes if you want to learn more. And if you have any other questions or things that you would like us to cover in these podcasts, feel free to send me an email. I love hearing from people and I love chatting, and I can't wait to hear from you. So you can reach me at learntarology@gmail.com. And I want to thank you so much for listening today. I hope that you got something out of this and can take this concept of being intentional and aligning your questions with the phases of the moon, take that into consideration and potentially apply that to your readings, and let me know how that goes for you. Well, thank you again for listening. And until next time, take care.